So we need to talk about this Ford headline that's making its way around the internet right now. And in it, the Ford CEO is on record saying they have over 5,000 openings for mechanics at the dealership level that pay $120,000 a year that they can't fill. And when I heard that headline, I had a reaction to it because it is disconnected from reality. It is a gross oversimplification. It is based on surface level logic. And I would argue it is completely false. And a few minutes of research will prove that if you don't believe me. But I want to talk about it not specifically to pick apart Ford or to throw shade on their CEO, but because this is a fairly common trend and it's gaining popularity. And I've been inside companies like this. I know how these roles work. I know the real challenges to filling them, but I also know some of the real problems behind them. And I know that a lot of leaders that genuinely believe that this is a possibility or that this narrative is true, they don't mean to be malicious. They don't mean to think negatively of people. It all sounds so reasonable when you don't take the time to question it or investigate it. And it ends up hurting everybody involved in the process. So I'm Christopher Lind, and this is Future Focused. And this week, we're going to talk about what we need to do about doing better at closing the gap between openings and people who are looking for jobs. Now, if you like this content, if you like the content that I put out there, I would greatly appreciate if you liked it, subscribe to it, give it a follow. And if you really feel so inclined, please check out buymeacoffee.com/Christopher Lind and say thanks financially. All right, so let's get into this. I'm going to break it down in terms of why this narrative isn't true, where the real problems lie, and then lay out, so what do we do about it? Because the reality is there are lots of open jobs and there are also lots of people looking for open jobs. And we need to close that gap because it helps both the people and the organizations that have them. But we got to talk about why this narrative is not true, because it's not. It's not. And like I said, spend 30 seconds doing a Google search and you will quickly see that it's not. There are not mechanic jobs that are paying $120,000 in base salary that they have 5,000 of them scattered all over and they just can't for the life of them find somebody to fill them. That is not an accurate statement on what's happening at Ford. And when companies like this say this, it's not accurate, but it feels plausible from a distance. It sounds reasonable. You can reason in your head, yeah, I bet they do make all that because I saw my mechanic bill when I had to take my thing in. And then those mechanics, they make too much. And if you're in Ford, you're the CEO, you don't own the dealership. You're not in there. You don't know what's going on. And so somebody brings you a report that says, we have 5,000 of these roles and here's the total cost to a job. You say things like this, not realizing that total cost to Ford is not what a person in that role actually has as a take-home salary. And they don't know the difference between total cost of a role and what I actually get paid every 2 weeks. But leaders are quick to trust reports at face value. And so there's a lot of assumptions that are baked into statements like this that sound close enough to be true, but are not at all. And what happens is when it sounds close enough, we'll fill in the gaps automatically. And we gravitate towards the simplest or most familiar explanation, especially when it starts getting into complexity. I've had some conversations this week where I've started talking about it, and people who are less familiar, you can just see the challenge they have of going, okay, my nice little simple explanation was a lot easier to think through than what you just described. Christopher, the way you just described it, that feels like an impossible challenge. It is and it isn't. It's a lot easier than you think, and we'll talk about that today. But I understand that's what happens is we gravitate towards these easier ones. The other problem that we have is that we have a tendency to believe that this problems lie with someone out there, something beyond my control, something that is not my responsibility. And by saying, hey, we offer these great paying jobs that are all over right now, and nobody's even applying to them and doing any of this stuff. That's a lot easier to go home and sit with than to recognize, well, actually, that's not true. And there's a reason people aren't applying to these. And actually, there probably are a lot of them that are, and we just aren't talking to them. But I truly believe that most of the time, this isn't incompetence. Okay. The Ford CEO didn't get where he is because he's completely incompetent. He's trusting the data that's being provided to him. He's trusting the people who are telling him this thing. And I'm sure he's hearing those things. And in his mind, it makes sense. And as a result, when people are under pressure, they jump to conclusions and they say things like this. So I think it's fair to at least give the CEO the benefit of the doubt and give any senior leader who says things like this the benefit of the doubt, but we have to push back against it because the consequences for this kind of stuff, they're real. This isn't just, oh, well, it'll fade into the, ether eventually. Real people right now are applying for jobs. And we're not just talking about Ford. I see this all the time. There are, I don't know how many openings right now that I know people that are absolutely qualified for these jobs. They're applying to jobs and they're not getting callbacks. And that is extremely discouraging if you are somebody who is actively seeking a job that you are qualified for, or you firmly have the skills and qualifications to be qualified for. Maybe you don't match it perfectly, but you know what you're capable of enough to know that I could close that gap. I could do that. And so when you hear things like, well, there's all these jobs and we can't find anyone, that's extremely discouraging. And so when you make statements like this, you are actually discouraging the people you want to be applying to it. And you're actually discouraging them from applying to it because those kind of statements just suck the wind out of your sails, especially if you're somebody who's been looking for a job for a long time. And if you look at any report right now, the gap between when people lose their job and when they fill a job is pretty wide right now. And that's at all levels. That's not just certain levels. So I'm not surprised there's a rather large vacancy gap at Ford. And I truly believe this is a problem for them. It's not, it's not that this isn't a real challenge they have to face. It's just the problem isn't that there's nobody out there that wants these jobs. And by saying so, you're discouraging. But it's not just about, well, Christopher, you care about not wanting to hurt people's feelings or discouraging them. Yes, I do care about that. I care about that a lot. But it's not just that. You're actually shooting yourself in the foot when you make statements like this. Because what happens is, do some quick research on this and you'll see the average mechanic at a dealership probably take home makes more around 48 to 60,000. Okay, about half. When you hear that they're offering 120,000 and nobody signs up, immediately people start looking around at all their colleagues going, are you the one making 120? The new guy or new girl that just started, everybody's looking at that one going, so you're the one. I've been here 10 years. You're the one showing up and I know this. And even if the person's like, I'm not making that much. Well, the CEO just said that's how much they're offering for these things. And it creates infighting, which discourages the people who are in the roles because now they're going, well, I'm not going to show up to work and give it 110%. If I know that somebody new on this job, I might as well just quit, wait, and go reapply. It completely disengages the workers that you have when you make inaccurate, false statements like this on a public forum. And then the infighting begins, and you actually discourage the people who actually are the ones carrying your company right now. It's pushing the blame onto people who don't deserve it. And there are real consequences to this, but not just for the people in the roles. Because what happens is you encourage a environment where leaders stop asking hard questions. They don't dig into, is this even true? Because they see, well, the CEO said it, so why would we follow up on that? And so systemic issues continue to stay hidden in an organization. And as a result, leaders are running around working tirelessly on the wrong problems. Blame keeps shifting outward instead of inward. And so this isn't just harmful to the job seekers. This isn't just harmful to the people in the roles today. It's harmful to everyone in your organization, the whole thing. I mean, you say a mechanic makes 120,000. I guarantee there's lots of people working at Ford corporate or other roles that don't make $120,000 a year, because in their head, they're not thinking total cost. You're sending this message across the entire organization. And so when senior leaders make statements like this causes real harm to everyone, including the person saying them. Because narratives are not neutral. They shape decisions and they shape people. So I want to then move over to so what do we do? Because the biggest challenge I see with this is that it's not asking the hard questions. It's not being willing to look internally. And most importantly, it's being unwilling to look in the mirror, because that's where really a lot of these problems are. And it's not to say this is your fault. So if you're hearing this and you're feeling defensive because you are one of the senior leaders that maybe is struggling with some of this, or a leader who's struggling this with on your own team, my goal is not to make you defensive. My goal is to help you see where the real problem sits so you can fix them. But we need to talk about the real problem being internal, because you can say things like, well, we can't find anyone. People are lazy. They just don't want these jobs. But that's not something you can do anything about. What you can do about is what you look in the mirror and you see. Because here's the thing. Right now, there are a lot of broken things. And I work with many organizations where I see these things happen, where, just for one, here's just some of the problems that I see. And then I'll share a story that I worked through. So you're not like you're just talking about this theoretically. I'll share an example of how I had to work through this myself. But right now, in many cases, incentives push for short-term decisions. So people see a report that says there's 5,000, jobs, and they're under the heat to get an answer to it. And so they just pass this along and go, we can't fill them. We've tried. These have been open forever. We've been actively recruiting on them, because depending on who you ask, you go to your talent acquisition person, they've had recruiters on them. So the recruiting person doesn't want to say, well, we haven't been doing anything. And they have been doing things with them. But the incentives say, hey, don't dig into the real solution. Just pass the buck. The incentives are to pass the buck, so you're not the one who's having to do the work. And maybe somebody else will. You can complain about it behind the scenes, but you'll pass that blame on. The other thing that's happening right now is there is so much cost cutting, largely driven by AI and the belief that AI is going to fill all of our gaps and solve all of our problems. But AI is costing companies a lot of money, and that money's got to come from somewhere. And if you listen to my podcast last week, I said, if we're going to fight against the tides of more, faster, better that's fueling off people, we've got to stop cutting costs with people and start investing in people. Because one of the things the Ford CEO said is that it takes 5 years to prepare for one of these jobs. Well, if you in simultaneous fashion are cutting your skill development efforts, at the same time, you can't find jobs, or you can't find workers for jobs that require a whole lot of skill training. That's a major problem. And one of the first things I thought when I saw this headline was, what is your pathway? What is your pipeline for people to build the 5 years of stuff? How are you bringing people in that have zero experience, but maybe are interested? And how are you building them up to that? But it's not just, oh, well, we're not developing enough people. A lot of times there's outdated job design. We're looking for the person who has everything. We're looking for somebody who fits every qualification. And I guarantee in a lot of these roles, you're not looking for a mechanic who maybe has no experience, or maybe has just a little bit, but is willing to learn. You're looking for your unicorn that will check all the boxes, fill all the gaps. We want somebody who knows everything. And I see this all the time in hiring. People are looking for that unicorn candidate that checks every box. And I'm telling you, it's a fantasy. That perfect candidate does not exist. And so when you really start to dig into a lot of these things, you quickly discover that the talent shortages, which is what we're talking about here, there's a real talent shortage for dealership mechanics. I agree that is a legitimate problem, but under the surface, there is unclear expectations, there's unrealistic demands, there's underinvestment, whether that's in compensation or whether in growth and development. There's no real growth path. I've had multiple friends who are dealership mechanics, and you ask them, like, what's your future look like? It's not great. And it's not limited to dealer mechanics. Most people, if you ask them, what's next for you, they don't have a clear path for that, which that's fine when you're hiring somebody into a role. But if you're hiring somebody in who's already at the ceiling, that's extremely problematic. And then time and time again, you'll run into leadership consistency. So many people leave jobs because of a bad boss. And so when you really start to break down problems like this, you quickly discover you're not going to solve it unless you look in the mirror, unless you actually take the time to understand where this really breaks down. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you this is why Ford can't fill these roles. I don't work for Ford. I haven't consulted with them on this problem, but I guarantee if I were to dig into this, I would find a lot of the different problems that I just described alongside this. And it's not that they just have all these wonderful jobs that people refuse to sign up for. There's a lot more behind it. And I'm not just saying that as a theoretical. So let me share a story with you about a time I had to deal with this, where I had to look in the mirror and I had to solve this, because I joined a very large organization and I inherited a huge organization that had some high turnover, and currently, when I took it, had a whole lot of openings that had been open. Many of them had been open for quite a while. Now, I could have come into that and taken the approach of, look, either just hurry up and fill them with any heartbeat, or I'm going to get rid of them. And we're just going to eliminate these roles. Obviously, we're operating without them, so let's just cut them, type of a thing. Or I could say, just get a body in. You have 30 days to find somebody, which you can do. I mean, you can dumb it down to the point where, anybody will take the job, or increase the salary to the point where somebody will pick it up. I could have taken that path, but I chose differently. And I chose to take the time to talk to people who were in the roles. I took time to not just look at a turnover report and look at a hiring report to see how long had these open requisitions been sitting, but why? What kind of conversations were we having? What was the job profile that we were actually looking for in these things? What kind of candidates had we interviewed, and why did we not accept them? I took the time to analyze the org and role design that I had in the organization and go, okay, if we've got this many roles open and we are still running, why? How is it that we can run, or what are we not doing by not having these things? And is that gap actually a problem to what we're doing? Is it inhibiting us from doing other things? And I had to listen, and I had to listen without defensiveness, because there were certain things that were within my control. Actually, most of them were within my control. Almost all of them, to be honest with you. And so when I started digging in, I quickly found that, yes, when I dug into some of these open recs that we were running without, some of them, we didn't need them. They were legacy roles that we had hired, that somebody left, and it was an open requisition. And of course, like in most companies, nobody wants to give it up. So it sat vacant. It wasn't really a high priority role for any of the teams to be hiring for. So they kept talent acquisition on the role, but they weren't really actively sourcing for it. They had other things that were more important than filling that role. Lots of the headcount that was open, and even a lot of the headcount that was active, was misallocated. Roles had just kind of over time grown to the point where we just had legacy job descriptions, and you just kind of hired somebody who matched that profile, and then you figured out what you really needed them to do. And it would have been very easy to continue doing that and just say, hey, keep all these open recs for this job that we don't really do that, but it's easy to find people who have that capability. And so the roles, they were built around these legacy titles. We had not taken the time to actually look at the capabilities that, one, we needed moving forward, but two, what really did people do, and what did they need to do that well? And accepting the fact that not just because somebody has done that job before doesn't mean they're the best person for the role. And you can rapidly open up your pipeline and rapidly open up your candidate pool if you're willing to consider unorthodox candidates. And then we had to go in and we had to acknowledge that we had to do some work on our compensation, and not just for the open roles. There were plenty of people in the org who had been basically left stagnant for a while that needed to be brought up to par with market value. And so I couldn't just change the value of the open recs, because I would have caused an imbalance, which is what talent acquisition was resisting doing, was hiring at these higher rates, knowing what other people in the organization had. We had to recalibrate all of the different things. We had to build growth pathways in there as well. Part of the org design was to say, what is a growth pathway for somebody who comes into this role? And how do we grow somebody like that? And even at the more senior levels, how do we prepare and backfill those roles? And what roles are eligible within our own org that we know have been being prepared for that? And it also changed the accountability structure. I had to change the expectations for every manager that worked for me to make it clear that they were not to be looking for only fully baked talent. There were key roles that we were looking for that, yes, we needed somebody who had specific experience and expertise in certain things. But it wasn't just they've held this job title before. It was, do they have these capabilities and these skills? And then what are we doing to make sure we're building a surplus of that in our organization so that should things shift again, we don't find ourselves in a situation where we can't fill these gaps. And so all in all, yes, it was a lot of work. I had to rebuild the org structure. I had to create clear growth pipelines for people currently in the role, but also people we were hiring into the organization. We had to completely redefine the roles, and we had to move people around. And that was not easy, as some people had been very comfortable with the roles they were in. And we had to say that you're not doing that anymore. You're moving over here and you're doing this. But here's why, here's what it does, here's how it rebuilds this. And we completely reset the expectations of the leaders who are currently managing people. However, because what I just described, I get is a lot of work, and it was a lot of work. It didn't happen overnight. But what did happen was the roles we needed, they got filled. And the high turnover that we were struggling with started to stabilize. In fact, it almost completely stabilized. The people we had in the organization grew. When we had leadership roles open or higher roles, we were never wondering, do we have even the capability internally to fill that? We always knew who could, and not that we only ever considered internal candidates, but we knew we had candidates that we could do it. And most importantly, our organization started crushing our targets. So yes, it was more work, but by shifting from this short-term thinking and shifting from this idea that if I can just take the quickest path, the easiest path, and either just sit there and complain about the fact that, well, we can't fill these roles, or we just say, well, obviously we don't need them. Let's move over and try and bring robots in. We actually did the work and it paid off. So if you're hearing this and you're in a position where you have to influence some of this, or you're responsible for some of this, I really want, as you get ready, because we're in December now, we're coming into 2026. I want you to think about 2026 as a year where, when it comes to hiring and jobs, and whether you're considering AI or people or how you're thinking about that, I want you to focus 2026 on rewarding alignment, not making excuses. And so when it comes to hiring, one of the biggest things you can do. So here's the what can I do if you're listening to this. First of all, one, drop the perfect candidate myth. Just right now. If you are somebody who thinks in order to hire somebody into your organization or into one of these open roles you have, or into a role you have, on your team, you have this mythical creature in your head, this perfect candidate that has all of these things, and they come with this pedigree and all of these specific experiences, and you're only going to hold out until you absolutely get that. You need to dump that mindset right now, because that candidate does not exist. even the one you think you have in your head is not that. And even if, okay, because if you hear that and you go, well, hell, Christopher, I did find that, or I'm interviewing one of those people right now. Well, here's what I can tell you. Either one, they're misrepresenting themselves because they've done a really good job at figuring out what it is you want and are telling you what you want, or they might be an immediate flight risk because you're bringing in the perfect person to fill exactly what your needs are today and tomorrow. And once they get in there, they've got no runway. They've got nowhere to go. They'll do the work until they're on cruise control, which will not take very long. And once they do, they'll start to disengage. They'll get bored and they'll already be starting to think about what's next. And because you hired them in at the ceiling, what's next is not going to look like anything in your organization. Because I know for a fact that many organizations, I mean, they'll make exceptions, but normally you can't even promote somebody within a certain window. And so if you hired somebody that basically is at full stride in 3 months, bored out of their mind because they've been doing it for decades, you're stuck and they're looking for something else. But don't just think about upward. And I think that's the other thing with this perfect candidate mentality. And I want to be sensitive to it because there are people who are experiencing ageism because it's like, well, yeah, that's why I don't consider candidates over 50. What? No. Growth is not just about upward. It's not just, well, that person's been doing this job for so long. It's about growing outward and not the kind around your waistband. I'm talking about the kind where people are given opportunity to stretch skills into new areas, maybe learn things that they haven't done before that are relevant. They're adjacent to things they've done before, but maybe not quite. Maybe they don't come from the same industry. Maybe they don't come with the exact same functional background. Maybe they don't come from the exact same job title. And so it's not just about people who are only in that role, but considering people who are out. And that should also be a reminder to job candidates to think about roles that you can tell the story about where your skills are, but you're not necessarily hiring for the exact same job title. But really, this message is directed at the people doing the hiring. And so I would encourage you to think beyond just the very narrow unicorn profile that you have defined for yourself. And I would encourage you to actually hire, as you look at candidates, hire for core capabilities, not the bullets in the job description, not the projects that you have, on your current task list, asking if they've ever done that specific project, but the core things underneath. What actually makes somebody good at that? And if you don't know, you better figure that out. But you should also be looking for people who are adaptable and curious, who also can meet trajectory. They know where the puck is going, not just where it is right now. Things that people who are clear and can demonstrate problem solving and are quick to learn things. Those are things that you should be looking for regardless of what their former job title was. And that's where, when I thought about this Ford thing, I went, I know lots of people who, if there actually was a 120K job and Ford was willing to bring them in and they didn't have experience or exposure in this area, but they said, I'm hungry for it. I'm definitely open to it. I'm adaptable. I'm good with my hands. I know how to work on things. I enjoy this kind of stuff. There are people who are willing to do it. So when you're screening, like if you're hiring and you're just screening for a checklist, if you're tasking talent acquisition to just find you somebody who perfectly matches the job description you pulled out of the waste bin of job descriptions, change your mindset right now, because when you're doing this, you're missing out on future leaders. Now, that's just a mindset shift in some of the things when it comes to hiring who you're looking for. But the other thing I would challenge you with, and not to overwhelm you, because if you made it this far in the podcast, you may be a little overwhelmed with how complex the problem can be. And you can't solve the whole thing at once. But I would encourage you, as you come into 2026, to accept that there is no universal problem. There's no universal root cause to the problem you're solving. And every system is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be multifaceted. But I'd encourage you to find in your system, the system within your control. Okay. And that's the biggest thing. The system that you look in the mirror and you see looking back at you, not the one that somebody over there needs to take care of, or the one you over there, the one you are responsible for. And find what are 1 to 3 things, within your system that is blocking you from being able to find some of your talent? And maybe it's what I just described before. Maybe it was the mindset. Maybe you're looking for these perfect candidates, but it might not be that. Maybe you are more open to it. So you need to take the time to talk to people who are actually doing the job. Does it even match what the job description is? And when you're doing this, as you're doing your diagnostic, especially if you're a senior leader coming in, going back to my story where when I had to dig into the organization, I had to make it really clear that I was not here to assign blame. I was not here to point out whose flaws, whose fault is this, who gets thrown under the bus for this, but to really seek to understand why is it that we're struggling to find some of these things. And be honest, tell me what the real problems are. Is it doesn't pay enough? Is it that the work is too frustrating? Is it that the job isn't what you were promised? Is it that whatever it is? But you have to be willing to diagnose without having those blame pieces, or people won't tell you. They're not going to give you the answers. And then once you figure that out, you actually have to be able to define measurable things that are going to show you progress. And there are things you're going to find that don't fix it. I mean, when I was doing that work with the organization I described before, there were things we thought if we changed would magically solve our problem. I don't want to present that story as though it was all buttoned up and nothing went wrong. There were plenty of things that fell apart, and we had to be watching that, because when we made adjustments and it didn't change the needle, we had to abandon it. We had to let go of it and say, well, obviously that's not really the problem. Let's figure out what the real problem is. But I will promise you, if you start digging into this, you are going to find that there are plenty of areas where you're not investing where you should. Your investments are in the wrong things. It's not that you're not investing. In some cases right now, I will say organizations are not investing. But I would say in many cases, it's investment in the wrong things. You have people that aren't clear what they're even supposed to be doing or where they're supposed to be working on things. And that makes it really hard to recruit somebody when you can't even really answer the question, what do you want me doing? What do you need me to be able to do? Where is this even going? If you don't have that clarity for yourself, you're certainly not going to be able to translate that into a job candidate. And you need to do an honest look at leadership in your organization. And that means the leadership in the mirror, the one that's listening to this right now and going, am I actually the kind of leader that I want to see and that I actually believe is going to close these gaps? Am I the kind of leader that I would want to work for? And if not, why not? And what are we going to do about it? And then making sure that you're doing the same thing within your org, and then focusing on, don't just look for people that are going to get into a job and stay in that job. Those days, I don't want to say they're gone. I don't know that they ever were here, but people need to feel like they have a path for growth. And that doesn't just mean a promotion. It means real growth in many different ways. Because I promise you, if you are somebody who is struggling to fill roles, is struggling to find talent, you're not out of talent. There is not a talent shortage. What you're out of is clarity. And that is something that you have the power to fix. So as we wrap this up, I hope by this point in the conversation, we can all agree that we don't have a talent crisis right now. We have an alignment crisis. We have a diagnostic crisis. I would argue maybe with AI, we have a little bit of a disillusionment crisis in what we think we can do and what we really can do. But as we come into 2026, I am getting more and more indicators that 2026 is going to expose a lot of the companies and the practices hiding behind some of these things, like we can't find workers. And that's an easy thing to say when the chips are in your favor as an organization. It's not a great thing to say as the veil starts being ripped off. And so the leaders who are going to win as we move forward will be the ones who can say, the problem isn't them, it's us. And we can fix this. So if you're somebody who listened to this and you don't want to carry the tired story of things like this into 2026, just remember the real work, the work that's going to make a difference is the work that happens with the person looking back at you in the mirror, not the person you're trying to hire. And with that, we'll see you on the other side.